So we're looking at the definition of God, that you are a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. And now let me ask, are there pizzas? Do pizzas exist?
Yes.
We all agree, right? Pizzas exist. Even if you don't want to agree, you know that there are pizzas, so you have to, right? In fact, I know that there are at least 3 DiGiorno pizzas in my freezer at the moment, right? They come in a package. So there are pizzas. They exist. Is there a largest pizza at the moment in Eagle River? I mean, it might be being eaten at the moment, so it's not going to be the largest pizza for long. So how's that for a quiz question? Is there a largest pizza in Eagle River or in the universe? Would you say, is there a largest pizza in the universe? There has to be, right? Because there are pizzas, which means even if there aren't any other pizzas even in Italy, one of the pizzas here has to be the largest pizza in the universe. Although there might be a planet of Italians where they have pizzas and make it a, main career move to be the person who's making the biggest pizza. Who knows? But the thing is, once you know that there are pizzas, and there are various sizes, so some are larger than others, logically there must be a largest pizza in the universe. Yes? Okay, well here we have, it's not exactly largest, it's greater. So who knows exactly what Anselm had in mind, right? But I would imagine that it at least requires it to be larger as a minimum, right? But by definition, God has to be greater than anything else you can conceive of. And I love thinking, well, if God doesn't exist, then pizza is greater than God. In which case, pizza will send out for you. Right? Which is a line from Spaceballs. Pizza the Hut, if you remember. Spaceballs. It was a movie. Mel Brooks made fun of all the space movies.
I'm still waiting for the sequel.
Needs a sequel, yes.
Search for more money.
Search for more money. So, I mean, pizza is just hilarious, I think. But when you get right down to it, the requirement is that there has to be something that exists that is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. And watch how he develops this, because it says, we can at least, when we hear this being than which nothing greater can be conceived, that it at least exists in our understanding. We know what that phrase means. Not necessarily that something exists that is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. But we know that we understand it. It's in our understanding, right? And yet we could still think of it as not existing, right? It does not, we do not understand it to exist. We just understand what the phrase means, right? But then he goes on, it is one thing for an object to be in the understanding, and another to understand that the object exists. 2 different things. When a painter, he explains, when a painter conceives of painting, he understands it in his understanding, but he hasn't made it yet. But once he's made it, then now it exists as well as in his understanding, right? He understands that it exists because he has made it. Hence, even the fool is convinced that something exists in the understanding at least, than which nothing greater can be conceived. For when he hears of this, he understands it. And whatever is understood exists in the understanding, and assuredly, that than which nothing greater can be conceived cannot exist in the understanding alone. Because if it did, then pizza, or whatever you would think of, exists, and that's greater than what, by definition, is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Therefore, if that than which nothing greater can be conceived exists in the understanding alone, the very being than which nothing greater can be conceived is one than which a greater can be conceived, something like pizza, or something that exists. But obviously this is impossible, etc. So, God cannot be conceived not to exist. God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. That which can be conceived not to exist is not God. Right? As a result of this, by the way, God is referred to constantly throughout the following orthodoxy as the only necessary being. Because logically, by definition, God must exist, right? We can have lots of other things, that cup and so on. The camera that I think I forgot to turn on. Oh no, I got it on. How about that? So the camera I know when I bought it, and I know eventually I'm going to drop the thing and it's going to be ruined, and I'll throw it out by taking it to Best Buy and recycling it, or whatever they do, right? So it's not a necessary object, because it was created and it will be destroyed. And I can conceive of it as not existing, because in fact I'm sure it didn't at one time, and it won't eventually. Same thing with me. Same thing really with the earth. Sorry about that. I love the earth. I hope it lasts for many, many, many generations or whatever. Or at least until we've conceived of a way of getting off the planet successfully and flown to other places that we could ruin, all that kind of thing. But nonetheless, I think we can all clearly understand that the earth is not a necessary being. It could easily be destroyed by us, by a meteorite, by the sun blowing up or going dark, etc. You name it. There's lots of scenarios we can imagine where the earth is no longer here, right? So virtually anything we can think of is not a necessary being, or existing is not a necessary part of its characteristics. But God, by definition, is a necessary being, because by the definition, God cannot be conceived not to exist. So truly, therefore, do you exist, O Lord my God, that you cannot be conceived not to exist, and rightly, for if a mind could conceive of a being better than you, the creature would rise above the Creator, and this is most absurd. Now, here's an interesting aspect to all of this. The definition, God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, is the whole set of characteristics associated with the concept God. It doesn't say anything else, for example, about God being male or female or any other sexual kind of gender. There's no requirement for God to be good, perfect, omnipotent, any of those things. So strictly speaking, when Stephen Hawking is trying to find what started everything, the Big Bang, what caused the Big Bang to occur that developed then into the expanding universe, right? What started it is exactly the same question, and I'm pretty sure that Stephen Hawking believes there was something there that created the universe, or that caused the universe to start, right? And that would be that than which nothing greater can be thought. It started the whole universe. Has to be more powerful, in a sense, somehow. So in a sense, I would argue that the definition of God that the Orthodox dogma gives us is identical to the scientific concern with the beginning of the universe. In other words, it has to be there. We just logically can't conceive of there not being such a starting point. By the way, this is actually another kind of argument. When we look at Aristotle, one of the things I did not cover while we were talking about Aristotle, but that St. Thomas Aquinas will develop, is the argument that there had to be a prime mover. That when we look at everything, everything moves. Everything that moves was moved by something else that was already moving, and that was moved by something that was moving, and that was moved by something that was moving, etc. So you have a chain of causality of movers until you get to the point where you realize, well, there had to be a first mover, a prime mover, right? Which was not moved by something else. That's Aristotle, right? And in that case, then, we call it God, right? Aristotle, by the way, might have also instead, or along with this argument, argued that actually everything has been constantly going ever since. Ever since what? Who knows, right? So in that sense, Aristotle may very well have believed in kind of a cyclical, eternal universe instead of one that had a beginning. But Aristotle also gives us the beautiful argument that you could not imagine that kind of eternal, infinite past, because if it did, we couldn't be here. Because we'd be, in a sense, time's arrow would be going the other way. If it's infinitely past, then instead of going this way in time, we'd be going that way. But that kind of argument is called the cosmological argument. This argument is referred to as the ontological argument. As you can see, there's lots of ways that we can look it up as a Wikipedia article. So ontos means thing, or the definition of a thing in Greek. Logical obviously means the logical, right? So this is the definition argument, the argument from definition. So the definition of the concept of God entails existence. But it doesn't give you anything else. So, when you hear this argument, it theoretically proves that God exists, but it doesn't tell you any of the other characteristics that God has. So it's not like, someone hears this argument and they go, yippee, it proves that Jesus is God. It doesn't do that. It doesn't do any of that stuff. It doesn't prove Allah, it doesn't prove any other of the characteristics that we usually want to associate with God. So you feel relieved that you know God exists. You're always worried, oh, now you know. No, actually it doesn't help because you don't know any of the other probably more significant characteristics, right? But this is the ontological argument. And it's quite famous, as you can see. In fact, a lot of folks will argue, and I think I might agree, that this argument is the most famous argument in Western metaphysics. Does that make sense? Because it's a still current argument. I'm obviously presenting it as an argument that succeeds. As you look through this article here, you'll see there are lots of individuals that critique it for various reasons and so on. We've got Anselm listed as first. René Descartes, when we talk about him, will have his own version of this argument. Spinoza, we'll talk about
Kant.
Spinoza, Leibniz, Kant, I don't know who this is. Kurt Gödel, I can mention tonight. That's pretty interesting because Kurt Gödel gives us a contemporary mathematical proof for this. Kurt Gödel, I should give you, look at him. Oops. Kurt Gödel was a logician from the Vienna Circle. At the same time that Wittgenstein was there. Because of the Nazis, he left and was invited to settle in a math institute at Princeton, which was actually invented and made for him, just so that we could get him out of Germany. But by the way, he was not Jewish, just so you know, right? You know, he himself thought that his problem was he looked Jewish. As a result, he was afraid the Nazis were trying to kill him, and so he was willingly moved to Princeton. And later on, Einstein, Albert Einstein, we've all heard of Einstein, theory of relativity. Theory of relativity, that was his wife.
Makes more sense.
Relativity Einstein?
Yeah.
A lot of people know her. But he moved to Princeton, to the Math Institute, so he could walk with Kurt Gödel every day. Their homes were right next to one another, which is kind of cool. By the way, one of the authors I like reading is Rebecca Goldstein, and she wrote a book about Kurt Gödel, and she described her days as a graduate student at Princeton. And one of her professors was Richard Rorty at the time. And she says she was in the supermarket. And by the way, Princeton is a crappy little town. It's really kind of small. So they don't really have a very big supermarket. It's kind of on the size of New Sagayas, basically, right? You've not been there, New Sagayas? It's not really big.
If we're talking about Princeton, Mass, I have times.
This is Princeton, New Jersey.
That makes significantly more sense,
Ah, okay.
which I've been to.
Yeah, that's kind of a small grocery, well, it's a supermarket, but it's small. But so, Rebecca sees Richard Rorty standing there looking confounded in one of the aisles. And she went over and was concerned and asked her professor, "Are you okay?" And he explained he had just seen Kurt Gödel in the frozen food aisle. It's actually pretty hilarious because you can't imagine him. He's fairly autistic, and his wife was the one that did all that kind of home ec stuff for him. So that was pretty weird. But Kurt Gödel was a Platonist and mathematician and logician, and in his version of the ontological argument, you look at it and it succeeds, he thinks, in proving that God exists. The other really significant proof that Gödel gives us is referred to as the incompleteness theorems. And incompleteness theorems basically argue that in complex systems, such as arithmetic, we have axioms that you have to believe, and when you accept the axioms, it follows that other propositions can be proved based on those axioms. But the axioms themselves cannot be proved in the system. They have to be accepted basically on faith. In other words, in order to have any complex system where you have axioms, for example, football games, you know how football works, you have rules of how you play football, right? You have to accept the rules or you can't play football. The ref or the, right, will throw you out. Right? Yes?
Well, I've got a question of this. So there's the ontological argument and there's the scientific alternative argument. Do you consider them both equally paradoxical, or do you think
What was the second one?
whatever the alternative argument was that you mentioned?
Oh, the other one, the cosmological
Oh,
argument?
yeah. Do you consider the cosmological argument equally paradoxical?
Yes, yes, but in a different way. The cosmological argument is based on our looking at an empirical reality, the world, and then making an inductive conclusion based on it. And so when we look at Aristotle's argument that there has to be a first mover, right? Which, by the way, he thought was the outer circle, right? So like, you know, the one with the stars, holes. They didn't think the stars were things. They thought they were holes in the outer circle. So, and as that moves, it moves the next inner circle and so on. So that outer circle would be the prime mover, the first mover, and creates everything that moves inside, right? But when you look at that, it's an inductive argument based on the idea that we can't conceive of that going on ad infinitum. There has to be a starting point, right? David Hume, who dies in 1776, to give you an idea when he was, right, argues that the problem with the cosmological argument is that how do I know that there has been this continuous chain of movers that's moved the mover that's moving the moving thing? That's right. How do I know that right now isn't the very first mover? I'm basing it on my memory, and my memory could be faulty. All of time might have just started just this moment. I have no proof that there's this chain of movement back for thousands, millions of years, right? It's just a guess. And so hypothetically, that argument fails to deliver the goods, right? You're not going to know for sure that there had to be a first mover because it's a guess. But the difference then with the ontological argument is that's based on the definition itself. So you don't actually have to look, say, at pizza, right? I like pizza, so I threw in pizza for entertainment value, right? But when you're thinking about the argument itself, all you need to know is that by definition, you've got something that by definition is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. And so that has to exist,
Say,
or the definition is a contradiction.
say a quantum computer or something exists that can take the things that are beyond the realm of human comprehension and can put them for us into terms that are within our comprehension. Do you think God or the catalyst for reality can be quantified ever?
by definition, I would think that God has to be the quantifier.
Hmm.
Not in the sense of the symbol that's limiting how many, but in the sense of the doer who's doing the quantification.
Yeah. Makes sense.
And I would assume, now we're getting into an interesting problem, though, when we start broadening the scope of what we mean by the concept of God. The argument doesn't support anything else, right? But the one thing that you get out of the cosmological argument, and there's more than one version of it, as we'll see next week, right, is that you could use these to say, well, nature is God's work. And so if God exists, God must have the characteristics that would have enabled this to have been made. And so what kind of characteristics can we derive from that, right? So if you think of it, the cosmological argument that gives you this chain of causes, right, would be exactly the same kind of inductive argument that I would use to do other things, to say that God likes beauty, God likes humans, God loves the common man because he made so many of them, right? On the other hand, God must hate the common man because he made him so common. Those are jokes. But you get the idea. We can extrapolate from nature and hypothesize on what kind of characteristics the Big Bang had. Precisely the way Stephen Hawking and others try to calculate it, right?
Would it not be the most logically backed leap to say that existence is as we know it, is the most efficient form of existence?
Can you say that again?
Well, I mean,
it's easy for me to say stuff like that, and
by efficient, I mean the most, all that does exist results from it being the easiest way for existence to occur.
I don't know that it would be more efficient.
Well,
I mean that an awful lot of things in my experience, the army, government, UAA, is not efficient at all, but has actually dominated its particular niche.
Well,
Try overthrowing the government.
There's some...
Might take them a couple years to realize you're doing it, but boy, then they'll...
There's some threshold where consciousness gets in the way of efficiency, and that's why consciousness is a sliding scale.
I don't know that there's any requirement for physics to have efficiency. I mean, practically any function is notoriously energy leaking.
Well, that's interesting.
It's actually kind of fascinating, because entropy is the second law of thermodynamics, right? And basically what it means is that all systems slow down, right? Especially if the system is a closed system, it will slow down. We're not a closed system because we have the sun, although the sun is a closed system, so that's scary. And your body's not a closed system because you're ingesting energy, etc., and oxygen and so on. But the overall idea is that entropy means that all systems, including the universe, will eventually slow down and become cold and stop moving, right? So all systems tend towards their own collapse, basically, right? And if you think about it, though, and look at life beats the heck out of entropy constantly. Because biological systems have been, if we accept evolution, they've been increasing in complexity, and so on. Yes?
I would disagree.
You disagree.
I would disagree. That would imply that there's some sort of plan within evolution, and that's not how evolution would work, I would argue.
Well, that's what I mean when I say efficiency, is like something exists with the sole purpose of replicating itself, and all that exists around us is just a runaway byproduct of something, of many different systems trying to expand and either take resources from other things or distribute
this would be a-
resources. So I don't know if I would
Actually,
say
I don't know
designed.
what his.
No, it's absolutely not designed.
I don't know if he's a physicist or a biologist or what, but Dorian Sagan, he's the son of Carl Sagan,
Very interesting.
pretty interesting, has this book, Into the Cool, Energy Flow, Thermodynamics, and Life. And he points out that life tends to expand in complexity. So if you're saying no, I mean, assume that there was a primal soup where maybe there was something like bacteria, and eventually we get single-celled animals, and then multicellular creatures, and we get mammals and us, and pretty soon we're going to have AI creatures. Who knows, right? So in that sense, what's interesting is life tends to use energy faster. So the more complex life gets, the more efficient we are at increasing entropy in the big picture.
Can you repeat that one more time so I can make sense of it in my head?
Okay. In other words,
I am very
As
sick.
life
if you think of
increases
the
in
entire universe,
Right.
do you have a ride? Are you heading in?
I found a ride and I'm very sick, so I asked him to come soon.
Okay.
So I
Well, thank you
apologize.
for.
No, thank you.
Okay. Do I have this on? So, okay. So the way this book works is life does get more complex, and we're much more efficient at using energy, which decreases, of course, the amount of energy in the universe. I mean, we're just a small part on a small planet, the little blue dot, as his father referred to the Earth.
So decreasing in entropy would be there is more order to the system.
Is that what I said?
Yes. The natural law of thermodynamics is things tend to become more disordered.
Okay.
I think that's where I'm getting hung up. Because entropy is a measurement of disorder.
So for example, before we invented coal as a burning fuel, the worst thing we could do is burn logs and peat and stuff like that. But we invented more and more complex ways of burning coal, and then we got tired of that and started burning gas and oil and creating other fuel sources, the sun, and so on. And we continue. I mean, the engine I have sitting out in the parking lot is incredible compared to anything I ever had before, right? And uses energy so that we're burning the energy and polluting our environment faster than we ever could have before. So in a sense, it looks almost like life's purpose is to use up all of our fuel sources and pollute our environment until we can no longer live here.
So speed up entropy.
So is that increasing? It is increasing entropy.
Because
But it would create more order in the sense that eventually you'll just have a impossible place to live. It'll be just a wasteland, like the Sahara. which they now think that might have used to been a lush environment where our ancestors lived before they were able to move on outside of the lush area that our ancestors lived on. So so when we look now, the Sahara is obviously not a place where anyone would thrive without aid from somebody, right? But I guess the argument, and didn't you always suspect that before it was a desert, it was a terrific environment for thousands and thousands of years?
I knew like the.
But we're in other words, we eventually end up with the entire Earth like Mars, which they're actually arguing, maybe there were people on Mars and they beat that planet to death faster than we're beating this one to death. Or maybe once they beat that one to death, they moved here.
Yeah. It's a fun idea.
It's not a very positive way of looking at the human race. But when you think of kind of the physics of it, it seems almost like so life is really just a complex way of increasing the way nature physics operates. Does that make sense?
So yeah, I think I was getting hung up when you said we were almost like beating entropy. I think that's where I got hung up.
Well, the first part of it, it seems like, hey, we're supposed to fall apart, and we do eventually,
Right.
but not before we've created plenty more of us to beat up the Earth more than just. Not all of us, obviously. I failed miserably at making more people. I got married. I thought that was supposed to be the first step, and I thought, children would be, just arriving, like in the Monty Python meaning of life, because I was Catholic. I figured, I'd be just like, you know the scene I'm talking about? By the way, this is not politically correct.